Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills. Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
January 6th, one of America's still great puzzles. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. Are you familiar with the events of January 6th, the supposed Trump takeover of our government system, of Congress, to protest the election, the supposed violent MAGA stormtrooping run of Congress, where who knows how many were killed, swept up in the chaotic fray, the deplorable protest movement that left several dead, several innocents dead. Are you familiar with that? Are you familiar with the truth about it? Well, guess what? To this day, it's still, you ask anybody, what happened on January 6th? And one person will tell you a peaceful protest. Another person will tell you it was a massive violent uprising. Another person will tell you it was Trump's attempt to take over the government, to instill radical dictatorial clampdown on our electoral process. The thing is, the videos that we see from January 6th, the videos taken by people's smartphones who were there, the videos shot by people who are at the scene, some of the videos that were confiscated by the FBI and by the law enforcement and so forth that have subsequently leaked out. The videos don't really match the narrative that the left wants to tell on this. And that's why January 6th is still America's great puzzler, right? Believe what you want to believe. The evidence is still very questionable that the government puts out, and so it's leading others to take up the cause of sifting through the myths to discover the realities, and then to have those findings questioned by those who either don't believe countering viewpoints that counter the government narrative, or those who are defenders of the government, perhaps because they themselves have something to hide. Yet another conspiracy theory, right? That's all we need. And coincidentally, just as Donald Trump is releasing, umpteen number of pages of documents and files on JFK. So maybe that's how it goes. One conspiracy theory gets cleared up and another comes along to take its place. But look, conspiracy theories very often, as we've discovered under the first Donald Trump administration, are labeled conspiracy theories by those who are actually doing the conspiring. And the labeling of what they're conspiring to do as a conspiracy theory actually works in their favor. So conspiracy theory or not, January 6th, either way, it comes down to there's a lack of evidence out there. There's a lack of official evidence. There's a lack of consensus on evidence. And so it's still a question mark in many people's minds. And before I get into more of that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app at Real Life Network. That is the news arm of Pastor Jack Hibbs's church out in California, RLN, right? Real Life Network. You should check it out online. You should subscribe to RLN if you're looking for some news that comes at you through a biblical worldview. That's not to say it's Bible preaching, but it is to say that the news that is put out by Real Life Network comes at you with a foundation of how the Bible is playing out in modern day, in modern time, against modern news. And so if you're trying to make sense of what's going on in the world, then you see this happening and that happening and this happening and that happening, and your mind is all a flutter with confusion because you're wondering, why is all this stuff happening right now? Well, when you're grounded with a biblical worldview, you understand that most of what's taking place, well, actually all of what's taking place, is preordained, right? There's an actual sovereign ruler over us, God, who is watching these events unfold because he has ordained these events to unfold. So it sort of gives you a more peaceful perspective as you watch the news. So, like I said, you can subscribe to many of the news products Real Life Network puts out and get some really deeper understanding and awareness of what's taking place in today's news. And so Bold and Blunt, I'm very blessed to say, is part of the Real Life Network news package, news products. So check it out. But I can't forget to remind you that you may also get Bold and Blunt at WashingtonTimes.com, my full-time employer, one of the best news sites in the business, right? Washington Times. And you can also subscribe to my newsletter there. Go to WashingtonTimes.com, find the newsletter section, click on it. I feel like I just repeat this every episode. You know why? Because I do. Right? Because I do. Because if you're a regular listener, you usually fast forward over this, you tune out for a minute. But if you're not a regular listener, maybe this is the first time hearing Bold and Blunt, and I want you to know, you can get Bold and Blunt right at WashingtonTimes.com and subscribe to Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley. That's my newsletter. Comes out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, delivered right to your email box. Contains my commentaries that I write at Washington Times, as well as my Tuesday and Thursday Bold and Blunt podcast, as well as whatever video Bold and Blunt versions I happen to do that week, which I do have a couple coming up, so you don't want to miss those. Those are usually pretty interesting. I say usually because I'm just being modest. If you want to know the truth, they're always very interesting, but I didn't want to be the one to say that, so it's implied. They're interesting. Check it out. Subscribe to Bold and Blunt. And you can also get Bold and Blunt wherever podcasts are available. Look at these headlines, right? Type in January 6th lies, just for fun, on Google, just for fun. Former January 6th Select Committee member reacts to the lying of the January 6th Select Committee. That was December 2024. January 6th insurrection fueled by lie Trump won 2020. That's sort of a badly worded headline, but what it means is the January 6th, well, first off, January 6th was an insurrection, right? See, there we go again. Was it an insurrection? Was it a peaceful protest, right? There we go. There's that big puzzler again. Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, October 14th, 2024. Opinion. January 6th, insurrection fueled by lie Trump won 2020. So they're saying fueled by the lie that Trump won in 2020. A lot of people believe he did, right? A lot of people that there's another one. There's another question mark, not just January 6th, but the whole election that brought about January 6th. Did I say 26? I don't know. Have to rewind and check on that. But January 6th is what we're talking about. The Trump election, the curiosities that occurred on election night. And look, if you were one who stayed up on election night and watched as the votes were being counted and the votes in the states and the electoral counts were being tallied, and were watching with optimism and confidence that, whoa, Trump won, Trump kicked butt, and then say, oh, I don't know, between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. you go to sleep because you think, it's a done deal, Trump won. And then you wake up the next day, and you wake up early the next day because you have to go to work, right? So you're up at 5 a.m., 6 a.m., whatever, 7 a.m., you get up and you find out, whoa, Trump didn't win. And you're thinking, what happened? And then you start seeing how the headlines were coming out that ballots, the counting had stopped, and people were kept out of the watching of the counts and so forth. And coincidentally, it was all the Trump people who weren't allowed in to watch the ballots being counted. And then this was being filed and that was being said, and Pennsylvania just completely disregarded the law that was just passed by the legislature in Pennsylvania, and they just did their own thing, and judges were weighing in, and you were wondering what happened, right? You call that a conspiracy theory, but there are some question marks over the outcome of that election still, and some very, very, very smart people came forward with questions in the days and weeks that followed, and even months, and probably still to this day, though I haven't seen them lately or seen their posts lately, but they asked some very insightful questions about the election, such as how did every sign that ballot watchers had referred to in every election as sort of signals of where the election would fall, how did every sign get violated under this election and Joe Biden won? In other words, Joe Biden pulled not just a rabbit out of his hat, but a rabbit out of his butt, right? I mean, it was so amazing, all the obstacles that Joe Biden supposedly overcame to win the election, that it was rabbit out of butt time. Forget the proverbial rabbit from the hat. It was even bigger than that. So that's a question mark anyhow. Another headline, Trump concocts brand new lie to justify pardons for January 6th. That was just in February 2025, February 10th. Oh, yes, MSNBC News. So we're not surprised about the word concocts, right? Brand new lie. I mean, could you shove more in there? Could you shove more opinions in that headline, right, MSNBC? No wonder nobody watches you. No wonder you have to let everybody go. And your budget now is like $6 a day, right? And dropping and dwindling. January 6th, 3 years later, NPR writes January 6, 2024. Well, at least they give a headline that is sort of neutral. But my point, and NPR's headline points this out, right? January 6th, 3 years later, there are still enough question marks over January 6th that news outlets are still covering it, right? They're still covering it as if it's a news item because, ding, 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 it is a news item because, ding, 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 it's an unresolved issue in the minds of many in America. And so what have Americans been forced to do? They can't trust their government narratives. They can't trust their regular media outlets. Truth, no. Truth, no. So they have to look elsewhere to get the truths about January 6th. And one such source who has stepped forward with his own investigative truth, deep dive to look for truths on January 6th is Chris Burgard. And I'm happy to say Chris is here to talk about his film that he made based on a deep dive investigative look at the facts of January 6th, and his findings really are remarkable. Chris, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blonde. It is so great to have you here.
It's good to be had.
I'm very excited when I have guests on who are able to talk politics and faith and how the two are joined at the hip in America. And I just wonder if through that prism, look out across America and tell me what you think the biggest perils are facing American citizens.
I think the biggest peril is that we're coming out of an administration that knows that in order to fundamentally transform the United States of America, you have to take out, eliminate, cancel those citizens that believe that our rights come from God and not the state. And that's really what we saw on January 6th. When we made the movie The War on Truth Continues, which was a sequel to Capital Punishment, everything they told about January 6th was a lie. What we discovered in this movie and making the miniseries is that the folks that were in prison over 2 years waiting for trial, over and over, they were not only decorated military heroes or law enforcement people, but they were all people of faith. And we began wondering, is this a war on Christianity? And the answer is, well, it's a war on truth. And as Christians, people are called to stand up and speak the truth. So that makes them targets for the people who are fundamentally trying to transform the United States of America.
So go ahead.
So I would say that's the biggest threat to citizens right now. We can go into other stuff that's come over the border and the other logistical threats we face now. But if you eliminate from the population that our rights come from God, not the government, then the country's gone.
And I want to explore January 6th specifically with you because I know you've done some deep dive analysis, a documentary. You talk about it all the time. And so, if there's any issue that is a little bit convoluted in the public sphere, it's January 6th. It's really difficult to know what's truthful, what's a lie, what's fabricated. What have you found? What's your take on January 6th?
Oh, my goodness. So knowledge is power, and we are engaged in the greatest information war this country's ever been in. And you can't blame half the country for being confused or thinking that it was a bloody insurrection, because that's what the propaganda programmed them to think. After 4 years of doing this, 2 movies, a miniseries, talk show, countless research, thousands of hours going over the footage, no doubt January 6th was a psychological operation run with military precision. That's what it was. And it was designed in 2 parts. The first part was to cease any investigation, to halt any transparency into the contested ballots in the swing states. You had to do that in order for to change the government, and that's what they're looking for. That worked perfectly. And the second part of it is to dehumanize half the country, and like I said earlier, to get rid of those people that believe our rights come from God. And there's a playbook for this, and you can tell how far the cover-up goes just by their own words. There was a fellow named Joseph Goebbels who said that if you make the lie big enough and tell it often enough, that it becomes truth to the state and then thus to the people. He worked for a guy named Adolf Hitler. And they made the most of an episode in 1933 called the Reichstag, and they burned the Reichstag. They were able to demonize all their political enemies, go out and destroy them. And that carried on into the trains. How did good Germans stay there and do nothing while their fellow Germans are put on trains and carried away to the deaths? Well, because you have to dehumanize them. And that's what the second part of the operation was, to transform the deplorables into bloody insurrectionists, so that when people like Master Sergeant Jeremy Brown or Sheriff's Deputy Colt Maccabee are in federal prison for over 2 years waiting for trial, you don't stand up for them because they're no longer your fellow Americans. They're now those bloody insurrectionists. And here's how you can tell how big the cover-up goes. When you have Joseph Biden, his entire administration, you have Merrick Garland, you have Christopher Wray, the FBI, Department of Justice, all the mainstream media saying that 5 law enforcement officers were killed on January 6th. 5 officers died. That's a lie. Officer Brian Sicknick was not bludgeoned to death with a fire extinguisher by MAGA supporters like they went with for months when they knew that was a lie. He died of natural causes the next day. And the other 4 law enforcement officers that died of suicide. That's something to really take a look at. They died of suicide weeks and months after January 6th. So why would people this high up in power say this lie over and over again? Well, it's to push the narrative that this is a bloody insurrection, and it's to cover up the fact that the 4 people that did die on January 6th, Kevin Greason, Benjamin Phillips, Roseanne Boylan, and Ashley Babbitt, were all Trump supporters. They were all constitutionalists, and they kept any investigation going into that. Yeah, Berg was investigated, but no one thinks that was a good shooting. Not the military folks you see in my movie, not the law enforcement fellows, not the 3-letter guys. Nobody. It was not a good shooting. Roseanne Boylan, eyewitness testimony, had her already unconscious on the ground, being beaten by Officer Lila Morris. They believe the 3rd blow is what killed her. And when it came to the heart attacks, you'll see in the movie, this fellow's just standing there on the other side of the protest, and munition flies over, launched out of a shoulder-fired weapon. Flashbang hits him in the chest and explodes. It burns the guy's face next to him. He turns away and screams. This guy goes down and dies of a heart attack. That all needs to be investigated. So just by the fact alone, how many people are in on the cover-up tells you how high this operation goes.
Okay, let's just go with that this was a cover-up, right? People listening right now, we'll just start from that premise. The next question is why? Because Trump had already, according to voters in the Democrat Party and many in the Republican Party, he had already lost. So why go through this trouble to stage this protest, anti-protest?
Because he hadn't lost. He hadn't lost. That's another lie. That's just like they also say he lost every court case that came up.
Right.
They had close to 60 court cases come up that they didn't take on, so there wasn't standing, so there was no discovery. The evidence wasn't brought forth. So what they did here, you had momentum, and you'll see it's not in the movie, but it's in the miniseries. If you look at the miniseries, you see inside what happens inside the Capitol building while what's happening on the outside. On the inside, Cruz comes into the House, stands up to Congress and says, yes, we have a motion to investigate the first contested ballots in the first swing state. The House erupts from standing ovation. You don't see that on the news. There's a standing ovation because now, as there's precedent for it, they're going to take 10 days to investigate this state, and they're going to vote on the next 5 states that come up. But when that happens, a flare goes up over the Capitol building. Seconds later, the breach happens. Once the breach happens, they interrupt Congress, they interrupt the session, and when they come back over 3 hours later, there is no longer anyone pushing for the investigation. So that was the moment that Biden coming in was for set, because before that, if they would have had the 10-day investigation, $100 to $1 says they would have found plenty of stuff in those states to say, wait a minute, we can't certify this election. And remember, at the same time, remember that the Inspector General's report was coming up, which was delayed, because the agencies, the intelligence agencies, wouldn't put forth proper data in a timely fashion. When the IG report finally did come out, it said that there was interference, definitely interference, foreign interference, and among those of the foreign interference was China, but yet, because of lack of evidence, it couldn't tell whether that was enough interference to change the election. All that stuff would have come out in these investigations. This was an operation to take control of the country. And what you'll see in the movie is, if we ever do have a real investigation in this, we point out people that should definitely be investigated. And the U.S. military or whoever conducts these investigations, I don't have a lot of faith in Congress at this point. I don't believe they have the political will to do this. But somebody needs to take a look at what America did, what the United States of America did in overthrowing the Ukraine in 1914. How did they help in that color revolution? Then take a look at and see if some of the same players at the highest levels of our government that were involved in that were also involved in being the architects of January 6th. That's where you should start this investigation from.
So there were a lot of critics of Vice President Mike Pence at the time. What did your research, what did your investigation show so far as Mike Pence goes?
Well, Mike Pence went with the deep state status quo. I mean, he could have come back and he could have said, pick up where we left. He didn't. He chose to certify those election results. He was part of hammering it all through. Whether he did that intentionally or not, I don't know. I don't know what's inside his head. But by certifying those results, he sealed the deal. He sealed the coup. When you see, I wish you could see this movie. I wish you had a conversation afterwards. But when you see former Capitol Police Lieutenant Tariq Johnson look straight in the camera and say that on January 6th, everyone on the ground that day was set up. The MAGA supporters were set up. The Capitol Police were set up. This is all a designed operation. And when you look into the people that set it up, you just have to keep going. This all needs to come out to the public. And there's another thing people need to understand. As bad as January 6th was, as violent as it was, I 110% believe it was designed to be much worse. And the person that screwed it up was Capitol Police Lieutenant Tariq Johnson. Because you can hear him on the radio as the breach is happening. He's asking his superiors for over 20 minutes permission to evacuate the Senate chambers and the House floor to get everybody out of there. He doesn't get it. The person he's trying to get the permission from is a woman named Yogananda Pittman, who, in the evidence that he and Congressman Nels put forth, is also the person that blocked all the intelligence reports that would have stopped January 6th from ever happening. So Lieutenant Johnson is asking for this permission, asking for permission. He doesn't get it. Finally says, I'm making the call. I'm doing it on my own. We're going to clear the Senate, and we're going to clear the House floor. And he's a good leader, and luckily his men and women underneath him followed him to be able to do that. It saved a lot of lives, because here's what happens. The rules of engagement for the Capitol Police of deadly force, you're only allowed to use it when you're defending bodies, senators, congressmen. If they're cleared out and gone and it's just real estate, you're not allowed to shoot to kill. So if Lieutenant Johnson would have been able to clear the House 20 minutes earlier, Ashley Babbitt would still be alive because the rules of engagement would have changed. If he wouldn't have done it at all or waited 20 minutes later, then all those people you saw coming into the floor of Congress, coming into the Senate chambers, they would have been shot and killed. And you would have had the bloods of 100 Americans running down the streets of the Capitol building. And that's something I don't think the United States of America would have come back from. That was the original plan.
Really quickly, before I go on to the next question, what's the name of your documentaries and how can people access them?
It's called The War on Truth, and you can get the War on Truth movie at thewarontruthmovie.com, and you can see the miniseries for free. It's a 4-part miniseries. You can see that at hisglory.tv, hisglory.tv.
Okay, so I assume when you first became interested in investigating J6 that you approached the data, you approached the reports with some level of skepticism, just to make sure you were doing your due diligence. At what point, or with what story or what bit of evidence did the switch flip in your mind and you said, oh my gosh, this is definitely something that was purposeful and strategic?
So that's an interesting story. It happened before everything even came out. I had been in Honduras on the ground in Central America when Cuba and Chavez tried to take over the government down there. I'd been in the middle of this. Had to leave early when they wanted me and my crew dead. So I'd seen the playbook on how to do this from the ground point level. On January 6th, I was there with my wife and my daughter. I was there with my partner, Nick Searcy. Nick, we got split up. Nick was at the Capitol. We were bringing up the tail end of the march that was coming up from the ellipse to the Capitol. And then my bells started going off in the beginning, because Trump came on almost an hour late, and he spoke forever, and it was cold, it was wet, it was raining, and he started repeating himself. I'm like, well, this is really weird. Well, it turns out that was very providential, because the breach that happened, the initial breach at the Capitol, Trump was still speaking. So it wasn't Trump supporters that were there starting that. They were still listening to Trump. As we're marching and walking up to the Capitol building, I'm looking around, and there may have been up to 2 million people up there. It was the biggest thing I've ever been into in D.C. I've been doing it for 20 years. And I'm looking around, and I'm looking at these grandparents and these families and these church groups, and people are singing hymns and patriotic songs. They're praying. There's all these different groups, all people of all different colors. But what there wasn't was any film crews, and almost no police. There was no film crews. And I looked at my wife, and I said, honey, I'm having deja vu back to Honduras. And she goes, what do you mean? I said, look around you. Usually you're tripping over film crews at these things. Where's CNN? Where's MSNBC? Where's Fox? And none of these guys are here. That tells me that this images you're seeing of all these peaceful people isn't the images they're going to want to go out with at the end of the day. And I've got a big concern for what's going to happen at the Capitol building. Just then, my partner Nick calls me, and he's at the Capitol building, and he said, I just watched the police move the bike racks. They're waving people into the Capitol building. And my heart sunk, my hair up on my arms. I look at my wife and I go, someone's going to die today, honey. This is not good. And when we got up to the Capitol building, we saw everything that was going on. We were by came up underneath the scaffolding and everything was going on, and we made our way around it, and it wasn't good that day. And there was a lot of rumors, a lot of people, and there was people there that just didn't hit as authentic. You could just tell, and even more so going after the footage. But that day, there were people, you'll see in the film, they're changing from Black Bloc clothes to Trump clothes. They tried to get my wife and I, my daughter, to attack the police. We said no. I ran into FBI agents on the ground. My dad graduated from Hunline Session, the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Went to these guys and said, look, you got bad people trying to get us do violence on the cops. You want me to point them out? No. Do you want this footage? I have it of them. I can show it to you. No, we're good. Do you want to take a report? No, we're good. So I just figured the FBI had it all handled. We didn't plan on making a movie until the narrative came out, and what the narrative was going on was so diametrically opposed to what the purpose of that protest was. And then when you, a few weeks later, have Christopher Wray, head of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the United States, sit down in front of Congress and lie to their face, saying that he had no evidence that there was BLM or Antifa or any anarchist events contributing to the violence of that day, that's just factually incorrect. We saw them. My military buddies saw them. My intelligence buddies saw them. I saw them. We filmed them. They filmed themselves. Case of John Sullivan, he filmed himself. He admitted it, but he's doing part of the operation. This reeks. If Mike Flynn was going to prison for lying to a federal agency, they came after me after I did the capital punishment. It had been about a year and a half. I was on the border doing a film with Tom Home, and I get back to Texas, my ranch in Texas, and the FBI comes a quarter mile into my ranch, and I find out I'm being investigated as a terrorist threat to the United States of America. 63-year-old award-winning filmmaker for making a movie, Capital Punishment, about January 6th. That was part of my inspiration for wanting to get back in and make the sequel, because as my partner Nick said, well, Chris, if they're doing this to you, what are they doing to everybody else? And that's why you see that January 6th was just one battle in a larger war that's going on in America. If you know the big doors open and close on small hinges, the hinge that makes everything fall apart is January 6th. Because when people, especially on the left, when they see the truth, when they see what actually happened, and they realize how badly they've been lied to for 4 years, the scales fall from their eyes like, oh my Lord, what else have they been lying to me about? So that's why January 6th is so important to the deep state.
And Chris, just finish with this. Just give a little bit, a peek into your background, your experiences, what you've done in life.
God has just put me in interesting places. It's been an adventure and a journey. I was in 2005. I was a Hollywood guy. I had written stuff. I had scored some put some music in some movies, but mostly I had acted. I had wrote and I directed a punk rock horror movie, and then I got married and found myself on the border. In 2005, never made a documentary in my life. Ended up making this documentary called Border. It screened for Congress. It helped stop the 2007 Bush amnesty push, just by showing the people the truth of what was happening on the border. And that got me blacklisted in Hollywood. I got picked up by a guy named Herman Cain, who was thinking about running for president. I ended up being his creative and strategic media director, made all his commercials, helped make his brand. And that showed me behind the scenes just what politics is really like. And man, you sit behind the presidential debates and elections with just a cowboy hat and a camera. People think you're stupid. They talk a lot, and you learn a lot sitting back there. And that set me on a path of making movies, documentaries about just the truth of interesting times in history. I've had 3 movies play for Congress: Border, Death Counting the River, Broken Dreams, and The War on Truth. We screened that on September 24th last fall for Congress. So we've taken this information to Congress, and it's really sad when you give them the information, they use it, and then they don't do anything with it. And but now there's a new sheriff in town, so he's looking a little bit brighter right now.
New sheriff in town, and I think the American people, to go back to our opening chat, the quest for truth, I think, is stronger in America than ever before. So one more time, where can people see the films? Where can they access them?
thewarandtruthmovie.com, and you can see the miniseries, the War and Truth miniseries, at hisglory.tv. And, what's the difference between a conspiracy theory and headline news?
Evidence, right?
It used to be about 6 months. Now it seems like about 2.5 weeks.
Yeah, they are coming a little faster and furious, or more furious, it seems. Yeah. Chris Burgard, I want to thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt, and for the very meticulous work you did to get to the truth on this. Thank you so much.
You betcha. Thanks for having me on. It was an honor. God bless.
And that's another Bold and Blunt. Remember, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at Real Life Network, at WashingtonTimes.com, and of course, wherever podcasts are available. Tune in next time. Meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.